Hello everybody and welcome to this webinar hosted by me, Nason Firuzmand, and my wonderful colleague here, Marianne Chidiak.
Hello.
We'll introduce ourselves a little bit more formally in just a second, but just to give you a little bit of background of who we are, what we do, and what we're going to be talking about. For those of you that are less familiar, as Halt, Ashridge and DF, we are part of one of the world's largest education companies. And what that means is we're able to service a whole range of different needs, from language training, culture exchange programs, educational travel, right through to executive leadership and development programs, which includes digital learning for global leaders, both in the content space as well as the experience space. So Halt Ashridge is a triple accredited business school with an international footprint based across many geographies, so from the Americas to Asia and the Middle East. And we have over 60 years experience of delivering executive education to global business leaders. For our customers, the combination of language training and leadership offers access to an even broader learning experience, as well as a greater investment in product development and academic innovation, allowing us to be able to put together great events like this with so many of you, which I'm nervously looking at. It's now into the hundreds, so it's wonderful to have you all here with us. And so the agenda for this session, it's going to be a bit of us talking to each other. So think of this a bit like a podcast. We're going to be talking about the topic of resilience. And how coaching can support that. But during this webinar, we're going to share insights and best practices around coaching aimed at specifically supporting leaders and businesses who feel that they need to build their resilience. And at the end, there will be an opportunity for questions. There is a Q&A button on your screen, so please feel free to click on that and ask questions as we go. And we'll try to respond as many of those as possible. And so to explore coaching in this context, as Halt Ashridge, we provide a broad range of interactive and experiential learning online and face-to-face. And if you'd like to receive more information about any of the things that we do, then please feel free to reach out either from the links that we provide or to ask questions, and we'll be happy to respond to those. So welcome everybody. It's really great to have you here. So to say a little bit about me. Hello, I'm Nason. I'm a chartered psychologist and have worked in the world of business for the past 20 or so years, supporting managers and leaders in all sorts of endeavors around leadership and management. I have a particular passion for looking at and supporting the development of human behavior through various programs. But for me, coaching is just such a powerful way of working with people. And to be able to support individuals through a journey from the point at which they realize there's something that they can do differently to being able to see them really grow and flourish is fantastic. And my role at Halt Ashridge is to head up the global executive coaching team. And together as a team, we support clients around the world to provide coaching solutions, one-to-one, team-based, coaching skills development, as well as when it's needed, specialist mentoring as well. But hello and welcome.
Wonderful. I think that's my cue with that a bit old photo, actually, Nason. I think, well, I'm Marianne Chidiak. I'm a coach and a coach supervisor, as well as a Gestalt psychotherapist. So I like to think I navigate these worlds, enjoying, how they intersect, as well as being very clear on how they're different. I was born and grew up in the Middle East, and although I've been living in the UK for nearly 30 years, and I've had the privilege in that time to work in different cultures and contexts. I think of myself as a relational practitioner, and my interest in the last few years has been in exploring and unpacking the concept of leadership presence. Through my work, my writing, and resilience for me is a core component of that, of what enables us to be present and available. So I'm actually really pleased to be doing this with you today, Nason.
Nice to have you as a co-presenter. It's slightly more lonely when you're presenting on your own. I've done a couple of these, and it's hard work when you're on your own. So it's nice to have company.
Delighted.
So, Marianne, if you're up for it, let's get the audience that we have involved a little. So, what we'd like to do is to get you to answer a question. So, take a moment to respond to the question on the screen. And the poll is going to be launched any second now by our wonderful technical support. Wonderful, thank you very much, Sophie. Right, so if you wouldn't mind, take a moment to just answer this question. How has your resilience been impacted by the pandemic? And then Marianne and I will just take a moment to look at these results and share with you some of our insights as well. So I can see that a good proportion of you are responding. Thank you for being so active. Up to 69% of you have answered. This is amazing. So we'll just give it a few more seconds for people to get their answers in. So how has your resilience been impacted? So either your resilience has deteriorated, got worse, it's been improved because for various reasons you've managed to cope and grow, or it hasn't changed at all.
I see someone answering in the chat, actually. Just click the button on your Q&A and then you'll have your answer contributing to the whole.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we have one in there. So somebody can't see the poll. Don't worry.
And I recognize that sometimes experiences might vary in different times. So it's not a one set answer, but just perhaps choose what feels, you know, the truest answer, just generally. Just if you had to choose one of them, which one would it be?
Yeah. So we've got one or two coming through the chats as well. Improved, sometimes better, more often worse. All right, so we'll end the poll there. And so hopefully you can now see the results.
Okay. That's interesting results, actually. Right. So we've got almost nearly half, 49% saying it has improved. And then, you know, about quarter each roughly either deteriorated or has remained the same, which is an interesting result. I guess intuitively we would have imagined that most people would have said it's deteriorated as a result of the pandemic. But of course, a lot of us assume wrongly that the pandemic has been a uniform thing for all of us, but actually we've had such a wide variety of experiences.
Absolutely.
So from those who had loads of time to those that have been absolutely overworked.
Absolutely, and notice the comment somebody's put up. It took a dip at the start, and I think if we look at the natural cycle of people's emotions during stressful times, that we do find ways of coping with certain things once we're given the time or the resources to be able to manage it. And I think if I take my own experiences as a manager of a team, as a father, as a son, you know, emotionally, I remember my ability to cope dipped significantly at the start. And then I probably agree that over time it's improved, but if I was to be asked the question, I would have initially thought it's deteriorated. I think people have put more thought into this than I might have.
I could have almost sort of said my experience is different. You know, initially it's very clear the lockdown was there, and I think as we move on and the period of this pandemic extends in time, then it's a bit more difficult to sort of know what's tomorrow going to be like. What's the level of uncertainty seems to be greater, and all of that affects resilience, of course.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I guess following on from that and actually seeing how you guys have responded to that question, I guess it's worth thinking about, you know, some of the things that we've seen during this time. So given the current context, the pandemic has been quite a unique set of circumstances where globally we're all faced with very, very similar challenges. One thing that I've I've picked up from conversations at recent events and talking to clients has very much been around, it's almost provided an opportunity for people to do things that they never would have dreamt of doing, or only dreamt of doing, but never had the courage to do because the context was so fixed culturally, organizationally.
Yes.
You just had to keep doing what you've always done and not necessarily think outside the box.
As you say, I think unique and not necessarily worse sort of challenges or more stressful always, but some of them have been, you know, quite incredible. For example, you know, how to disinfect a whole building on a regular basis, something that a lot of managers had to face, or at least an
Quite.
office.
Yeah.
But more likely something like how to continue to provide, you know, a quality service, whatever your industry or work sort of context is, where with lots of people operating remotely, or a percentage of your workforce needing to come to work, and others can't. And how to make these decisions. I think the uniqueness is the need to actually keep flexing your decisions based on the uncertainty of the pandemic and how that's evolving. And of course, we're seeing this need being very localized now. And so, yeah, very, very unique challenges. But I think we're seeing existing leadership challenges also exacerbated by the pandemic, at least in my work. And so the physical isolation means that many are having to adjust, for example, to a very different way of working, maybe a more stifled, less effective. For example, you know, a leader that may have already be grappling with interpersonal or influencing challenges can find himself, for example, more restricted by the remote communication. You're not able to operate or influence in the same way, catching people for coffee in the corridor. So I think that sort of social isolation has come for some with an increased sense of disconnection.
Yeah, absolutely. And conversely, I've also heard a lot of people talk about almost an over-connection.
Right.
So I think some people have overcompensated in some areas where I've heard of meeting fatigue, where
Yes.
every day or every other day or every week there's a meeting put in so that people can connect.
Yes.
But then there's been no necessary sort of flexing of that connection to adjust to people's needs. So it's been, well, we need to connect because we're not seeing each other in the corridor. So let's put a meeting in every week, and people go, oh, that's another one.
Exactly. So it's interesting. So they're experiencing the demands of work without sometimes the social rewards of work. You know, the work can also be a professional family. So, you know, the casual chat with a colleague, the sharing snippets of holidays, etc. That's what's been missing. But there's been very little time to switch off between things, between meetings. And usually, you know, the journey to or from work gives us this sort of switch off time, this transition time. But now at the click of a button, we're in another meeting, and we end up feeling probably, you know, the intensity of having to perform all the time and no downtime as well.
Absolutely. I think one thing, just sort of carrying on that theme, is this sense of I'm trapped, not only physically because of what's going on outside, but I've got my computer and I've got my phone, and I'm getting phone calls at all hours of the day, and because, well, I'm not going to be anywhere other than here, I have to answer. Yes. And I've had so many managers, you know, in coaching conversations say, I feel like I'm letting my colleagues down if I don't answer because, well, they're doing it. And for me, it really raises that question of role modeling on both sides of the coin. You know, what is it that managers are doing to role model the correct behaviors, to actually safeguard people's well-being and their time, to say it's okay to finish work at a reasonable time and to go and be with your family who's in the same house that you're in at the minute.
Absolutely.
Versus members of a team feeling comfortable and confident enough to not respond to an email or a message or pick up the phone at 9 o'clock in the evening, like somebody told me this morning, on the basis that I'm not at work at the minute.
Yes.
So it's fascinating the way people's behaviors have shifted, in some ways very good, in some ways terribly.
Yeah. And so I think, you know, the point you raise is an important one, because I think it gives us all and people at work at the moment with a less of a sense of control of our time. And we know that, in fact, there's usually no correlation in the workplace between necessarily hours you work and how stressed you are, But actually what is most stressful is how in control you feel of what you do.
Yeah.
And I think not having these boundaries actually make us feel even less in control and more uncertain, you know, above and beyond how uncertain the situation or the demands of work are.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've got a good question here from David, who's saying, how do you define resilience, and how would you measure it?
I mean,
what are your thoughts?
we could spend, I mean, I could spend, you know, a day on this easily, but what I found helpful is to view resilience as the ability to sustain stress without losing functioning. Okay. So, you know, what stress means, of course, varies from one person to another, but actually it's about, you know, and I like the definition that comes from a social ecological system. So the ability of a system to sustain stress without losing its original functioning. So the more adaptive you are, the more range you have to respond, then the more resilient you are. I can say a lot more about that, but perhaps for another time. I don't know if you have a view on that, Nathan.
Well, I think that's all a very good point. And I think resilience is very much, it's not about just being able to bounce back from something. I think that for me, that's a really important distinction. You'll see lots of people that talk about being resilient and how you cope with stress so that you can come back and be positive again. And for me, it's much more around the adaptability, the noticing what's coming around the corner so that you can respond in a different way, so that you're not just coming having more punishment, as it were, from the circumstance.
Yes.
And you know, I think
yes,
if the support that people are getting is only to make them feel better once they've been knocked down, then it's the wrong type of support that they're getting.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. You know, it's about flexing and having the range available to all of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
I guess is that. Oh, there was an additional block. And I guess, was there anything for you that you'd describe as being surprising about what's currently happening?
I think not above and beyond what I've said. I think what I would like to mention is perhaps what has been less visible in the current sort of challenges, is that, especially in workplace, is that following, you know, lockdown and the summer meant that many people that have parents or caring sort of responsibilities at home are still juggling with so much, you know, taking care of especially young children as well as doing a half decent job at the same time is for me a near impossibility. And so the resilient issue here is that often individuals, we all feel that, you know, we're used to feeling ourselves as being efficient and effective. And of course, the big challenge here that we can't be. And I think the important one is how to accept that and sort of reframe given the situation.
Absolutely. There's an interesting question that's come through, which is, you know, where improved resilience has been seen in teams, do you think managers will continue to see this in future, even outside or after the direct impact of the pandemic, i.e. in the day-to-day? And is this realistic, or can people be more resilient in the short term, but not for a sustainable period?
I think it depends on what happens, actually, because I think there's an implicit assumption in the question that the resilience is only dependent on personal factors.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I'd like to challenge, and maybe we can say that more of that if we have time. But I think resilience is also a contextual issue. So I think as managers, you know, a lot of organizations have lent towards their staff and have sort of, you know, made sure that there's more perhaps discussions, you know, created a sense of community in crises. And I think that supported resilience. And what's really important is not to lose sight of that as we go forward. So I think resilience is of course we can be more aware of it and put in some sort of plan to maintain it and be, you know, heighten our own awareness of when we step out of that zone of resilience. But I think context and work context is super important.
Yeah, absolutely. A really good question.
Yeah, agreed.
So I guess a little bit maybe about how we use coaching, because there's quite a few questions coming through about how we minimize burnout and how we look after, ourselves to make sure that we're able to be resilient.
Sure.
So
yeah, I think for me, primary resilience coaching is a very personal approach. So it's really not a methodology to be applied. And of course, I meet individuals with very different resilient challenges. So I need, as a coach, to make sure I understand the need and the wants of the clients. And sometimes it's different from what they are actually asking for initially, interestingly enough. So yes, we do have at one extreme, the really overwhelmed individual who comes to coaching in a near collapsed sort of state. Stress levels are high, performances drop, they're really nearing burnout, and they can't switch off in the evening, and I think I get these we get these little indications, I can't not check emails. So you have the symptoms where they're, tired but wired, and you can sort of detect this through lack of sleep, etc. And I think the first sort of, the really primary intervention here is how to learn some regulation skills, some self-regulation skills, how to lower physiological stimulation, because their body is responding as if they're constantly under threat. Their cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone, is high, and that needs to be managed down. And there are some things that are very simple that work. And of course, a regular exercise, even a walk, some mindfulness practice, just breathing exercises. I think if we had time and we did a breathing exercise, we'd all notice a difference. Or I could invite everyone on the webinar to actually, just imagine your favorite walk. We've all been encouraged, we've all gone for walks. Just imagine your favorite walk. What you see in front of you, imagine your pace is slow, you don't have anything expected of you afterwards. And immediately, I think you will all notice, and I think I do now, an embodied response. My chest, my shoulders come down. So I think what happens with burnout is that these individuals lose their ability to access this soothing place. And so coaching really is around, trying to upskill them again, to go back into what we call the window of tolerance, really, in terms of resilience. So that's on one side. Otherwise, I think, you have other individuals that are coping, but the increased demand means that the coping comes at a high cost. So long hours, no time for exercise, family, all these things that nourish us. So it's fine for short periods of time, I find, but it's often not sustainable. So the issue here is that often these individuals are caught up in still trying to perform in the same way they did before the increased pressure or demand. And so resilient coaching for me needs to challenge sometimes quite a rigid view of who they are or need to be at work. And that isn't easy, because, often we all care deeply about our work, and our sense of identity is also caught up in our working life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So there's something about letting go of the edge of perfectionism for some, perhaps. And we all know that if we expect something, of ourselves and don't achieve it, then we all have this internal narrative, the self-critical voice kicks in, and we inadvertently almost place more pressure and demand on ourselves than any boss or situation would. We all know this place. So the resilient, the challenge box here is about challenging the ingrained fixed narrative of how we should be at all the time, and developing a more compassionate one.
There's some very relevant questions actually coming through as well, and I'm very conscious of time and wanting to be able to answer these. My need to be able to respond to people's requests. But there's one here is, I know my resilience is low, and I start to panic. I tend to avoid asking for help. When you see colleagues or employees who are struggling, it can be intimidating to reach out. Have you got any advice?
Yes.
I guess talking from first-hand experience, I think we all need to be a lot more aware of everybody's sensitivities, yes. From the point of view of being there to ask, "Are you okay?"
Yes.
And being able to feel comfortable to just inquire. Sometimes a person just needs to know that you've noticed, and for that to be enough.
Yes.
They don't necessarily need a lot of inquiry, yes. In order to open them up because they might not be ready to do that. But the fact that you've noticed and you've inquired after their well-being can be hugely powerful and supportive.
I think this is, I've got a really interesting case where I'm working with a senior leader, a very public facing, very tense role. And in her narrative, actually, and personality, she's got a lot of personal resilience, quite a force of nature almost. And in fact, she felt she needed to keep her people, very positive and optimistic rather than, a bit of negativity. And I think sometimes it's really tough for people when they're not feeling very resilient to have this kind of superwoman, constantly optimistic leader. So I guess the point here is to remind ourselves as leaders that we have almost a responsibility to share some of our vulnerability, because then that opens the space for other people to share, and within a realistic, optimistic frame, also be able to connect with others. Often, I think what the question is inviting for me is a sense of, oh, I can't say I'm not struggling, or I can't approach someone else who's struggling in case it's shaming for them. And so how can we create some context where there is a bit of a share of the struggle in a realistic way? Yeah. So I don't know, shall I just say something about the preemptive approach maybe?
Yeah, please, would you?
I think for some individuals, which I think I'm seeing more now, which is lovely, is to sort of say, well, we know that tough times are coming, and we need to, particularly in some industries, where COVID fluctuations are probably high, and they want to put in place a maintenance plan, where here the work is mostly about looking what stress means for that individual particularly, and working on almost early signal and response strategies. So we all know what stress is. I mean, we're human beings, therefore we know that. But the earlier an individual can detect that they're operating outside of their window of tolerance, the sooner they can take action to address it and mitigate the impact of that. So it's about finding some solid strategies and resources to cope. And I usually start with, how can they prioritize each day something that nourishes them? Family time, sports, exercise, alone time, reading, whatever that is. How can they start a certain practice of self-regulating habits? So actually really get into some sort of systematic habit. I work with, the body, the breathing, somatic resources, as well as interpersonal resources, because who else is there for them? Let them look we're all relational beings, and we often forget that what settles us the most is good contact, good relationships with others, be it in work or out.
Absolutely.
And I think often, when I think preemptive is we forget that we need to look at the situations or conditions that support us to be at our best, and try to engineer some of those. So building on our strengths and feeling good about what we do, because this carries us also through stressful times. It's a bit like a vaccination, but like an inoculation of things to come. So I think that's really what some preemptive coaching would be doing.
Yeah. Well, we have a poll for people to get involved in if they'd like to respond to this one as well, just to see what your view is on whether or not it's most important for yourself, for your team, for the organization, or it's just a passing thing and actually it's not something that we need to worry about really. Okay, so we've got people responding at a rate of knots, which is really good. So at the minute we've got about 50% have responded. May or may not be surprising for you to know that it's relatively even.
Yeah, I haven't seen that. Yeah.
It's relatively even. It's very interesting. So we've got about 65% of people that have responded. So there's a few of you that have got us in the background listening to while you're making your lunch. Just pop back onto your screen to have a quick vote. Okay. And I'll close down the poll in 5 seconds. Last chance for votes. Okay. So here you go. These are the results in.
Right. Me, Okay, my team, my organization. I'm glad we only have 3%. It's just a phase, but I guess, you know, maybe that is an optimistic perspective, though that's fine.
Well,
And
it's interesting because,
yeah,
you know, if you think about why people have coaching generally, and actually a lot of the coaching that we do in some way is to support people to understand what their limitations are, to see what the opportunities are, to think through problems and challenges differently. And you know, there's a number of questions that have come through, like from Steve. You know, why are some able to manage resilience more than others? There are things like how do we actually notice when burnout is likely and how to avoid it? Or Beth said, many of us have directly experienced what we're talking about, and is there sort of analysis as to what's being shown? And so, you know, I think there's something in coaching that is inherently there available to people to be able to pick up on what's going on for them personally at that moment, and so builds up resilience in different ways.
I think, you know, coaching, you know, in terms of resilience, there's a big part around heightening awareness of your own process. You know, and I think the why some people are more resilient, you know, I think we can spend again a lot of time and go to really psychological reasons, but primarily, you know, there is a bit about, you know, how our past experiences have or not equipped us to deal with this particular challenge. And so some people might be extremely resilient facing some type of demands and less resilient in others. And I think recognizing when we are triggered is really the key here, because then, you know, we're no longer responding from a, you know, fight or flight perspective, but we're really engaging, you know, our rational mind, our prefrontal cortex, to sort of do the best we can in the situation.
Yeah,
of course,
absolutely.
our decision making is best.
So I'm very conscious of time.
Yes.
So I might skip this one actually,
Yeah, I think
and
we
go
said,
to this.
yeah, we talked a lot about it.
Yeah, and you've already touched on in a number of things that you've mentioned, Marianne, around the different ways in which we can manage our resilience, and the things that as coaches that we can work with individuals on. And people looking at this now and listening in will actually pick on things which I think will resonate more than others.
Yes.
And if I may, just picking up on one that, you know, in our conversations, Marianne has always struck a chord with me around the narratives that we tell ourselves. So the bottom right one.
Yes.
And I think certainly through my coaching practice is noticing that people do hold on to their own narratives very strongly, because it helps to define who they are and gives them that sense of certainty. So when somebody says, "How are you?" "I'm fine." Or if their default is "I'm not." But what is it about who they are that is defining their perception of what they're doing right now? And do we take enough time to reframe that, Alex?
Yeah. And there's a rigidity about needing to stay with that.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I'd like to sort of point out in what I can do differently is to understand that actually our negative thinking is there, you know, it's an evolutionary habit. You know, it served us in, you know, when we were in caves and coming up of your caves and seeing a snake and a beautiful flower, it served to pay attention to the snake here. So actually negative thinking is habitual, it is part of who we are. But a key question for resilience is to ask ourselves, is this thinking or activity supporting me or not? And I think if you can just ask yourself that question, that will be so important. You know, so how can I orient my focus towards strengths and towards what I can achieve rather than what I can't? And I think that gives us a sense of feeling less like victims of the situation and of stress. And that feels absolutely crucial to avoid burnout.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, that whole focus on being preemptive, you know, using coaching as a way of enabling people to be more mindful so that they can be responsive rather than just reactive, and being able to live within that dichotomy. So ironically, having just skipped a slide, you know, this does actually make a lot of sense. Operating within these polarities that exist,
Yes.
is quite real and relevant.
Absolutely.
So I'm
Lovely.
conscious that we have got to our time of presenting things, and I want to open up the forum for more questions. So if I skip forward um, and take the opportunity to answer some of these wonderful questions that have come in from people. Um, so Janet has asked, I'm interested to know how do we help leaders measure their own resilience, a meta awareness? Well, I have a short answer, which is there are various tools out there. So Ashridge, for example, we have developed a resilience questionnaire, which looks at 6 different dimensions of resilience. And it looks at your personal ability to respond to stressors and stimuli, as well as your perception of your context and the environment. So there are different ways to do it. And we can produce a cumulative report across an organization. So there are things out there. Do you know of any, Marianne, in particular? That
not particularly questionnaires, but I can think of dimensions of well-being that feed into resilience. And I think starting monitoring, how attentive they are to measure this resilience, how attentive they are to their own process, how quickly they catch themselves. And I think all those sorts of things could be measured in that way. But ultimately, I think you fill in, it's not the sort of thing you can fill in just with a questionnaire. I think, discussing that and sort of exploring that with an individual is usually quite helpful.
Absolutely.
Especially that people will know when they dip in resilience.
Yeah, exactly. So we have a question from Deborah. Are we talking about emotional resilience or professional?
Both.
Yeah, well, that was my instinctive response.
Both. I think it's interesting, can we really separate actually those things? Because in fact, if our emotional resilience is wobbly, I think how can we really make decisions actually, in our professional lives? So I think there's a bit of both.
Absolutely. No, I'd agree with that. And I think your emotions turn up in your professional setting, or are affected by your professional setting, or vice versa. So you may become more emotional because of what's happened professionally, or your emotions might come in and affect your professional setting. Absolutely. So from that point of view, it isn't possible to separate the two, and therefore your resilience is therefore something to be looked at from both an emotional and a work-related setting. Yeah. We have a question from Sandra. What are the indicators of adaptability for individuals, groups, and teams, etc.?
Well, I'll leave that one for you, actually. I think that sounds like...
It's a really great question, Sandra. And I think that's probably another webinar. There's a lot in that.
Yes,
my background's in psychology and psychometrics, so measures of adaptability are far and wide. And then to expand that further out into individuals, groups, and teams, there's lots of different things. If you reach out, I'll put you in touch with our assessment team, who have a compendious knowledge, a very big array of knowledge of things that can be done. So something to come back to. There's a question here from somebody. It says, define self-regulation.
Yeah. I'm not sure what the question is, but I imagine it's about, when we self-regulate, and I think there's something about saying, how can we know that we are in our window of tolerance? And it's generally the case that the brain functions well when we are within a certain window, and we can effectively process stimulus that comes to us. And then in that window, we can reflect, think rationally, and make decisions calmly without feeling necessarily overwhelmed or withdrawn. But during times of stress, when, things come at us, I think people just sort of step out of that. And that's what I mean by not being sort of regulated and knowing when we're stepping out. We can either go to a fight or flight, hyper-aroused response, a lot of anger, or, a hypervigilance, anxiety, etc. Or the other one, which is, oh God, I've no motivation, just let things go. And I think both those things are not triggered responses or not regulated responses. I don't know if that helps.
Absolutely. So this is an interesting one. How do you build a business case for leadership resilience coaching within organizations? Wow. If I had the answer to that, I'd be a very wealthy man.
Well, I think it speaks for itself, because I think if you link the amount, what primarily stress and the lack of resilience does is it affects the immune system. And I think, let's look at, how many people sort of go out on lots of different types of illnesses. And I'd be really interesting to see if someone's tracked that, in terms of periods of stress, what's the, how many level of absenteeism, etc. So in terms of, the usefulness of doing this for an organization, it's probably immeasurable, both for physical effectiveness as well as, operational effectiveness.
Absolutely. I think knowing, I head up a coaching team, and so from that point of view, I see the data that comes in terms of the impact that our coaching has for organizations. So when you talk about building a business case, I guess as long as the conditions for setting up the coaching within the organization are done properly, then you're pretty much guaranteed a successful, positive outcome. In that, if you're selecting excellent coaches that are highly qualified and trained, who have coaching supervision, so their own well-being is looked after. You're nodding away, which is wonderful, so I'm saying the right thing. But also that coaching community is part of a community, so that when they are working within your organization, that they're part of something which sustains their ability to look after your clients, the people that are within any business. And so if you're, by having that in place, the coaching that you'll get will be at the highest level with the highest quality of coaches. And so you will get a return on your investment within the business. And I see it time and time again, where the feedback, the testimonials that come through is that this has been life-changing and that it has a wonderful impact on an organization. So from that point of view, there is one caveat, which is not everyone is coachable. That's the other thing, people need to want to do something differently. They need to be at least self-aware enough that knowing that coaching can have a benefit. Otherwise, it's a waste of money and time. So you might notice that somebody's really struggling with their, the risk of burnout. But actually, at the end of the day, unless they want coaching, they're not going to be effectively supported.
And sometimes resilience coaching comes through another way. I mean, I sort of noticed that I end up doing a lot of that. And I think the presenting issue initially is about, anger or irritation in the workplace, or sort of some interpersonal issues. And I think that's a sign of actually not, feeling steady enough in ourselves. So often the issue isn't, I'm not coping, because that's quite difficult to say, I think, for most people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Through other ways. There's an interesting one here: how to promote a company culture where managers step forward. I mean, it's such a challenging question, really, because I think it is a culture. My first instinct is how often it needs to be modeled from the top. So the leaders need to sort of have within them the capacity to sort of speak and show that actually being vulnerable is okay. So that goes back to the narrative. What's the narrative? Is it okay for us to be struggling? Is it okay for us, to take some time out because we're, home tutoring our kids? And I think all of that, is intrinsic to making an organization resilient, and not address burnout before the people are just, walking out of the door already.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to thank everybody very much for taking the time to join us today. We've overrun just very slightly. But if you do have any further questions, and I'm sorry that we didn't get a chance to answer all of the questions that have come through, but we will be sharing the slides, and you're very welcome to get in touch with us to find out more, or to talk to us on a one-to-one basis if that would be of use to you. We do have a special offer at the moment to support leaders with coaching during this particularly difficult time. And our coaches like Marianne herself and others who are specifically trained and skilled at working with people during times like this will be available. So we thank you again for joining us, and we hope that you have found this of use.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne, for being with me.
It's been an enjoyable chat, Nathan. I'm looking forward to some more.
Absolutely. Take care.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.